Once we finish today, we will write up what our little conversation. We'd like to include it within the glossy report that the Alliance will produce in the spring, but you will have editorial rights over your entry before we submit it to the Alliance, so hopefully we'll get it all correct. So could you start by just telling me a little bit about The Haven, please?
Absolutely, I'll start. The Haven is a behavioural health centre for women. We've been around in The Haven for 47 years, I think it is. We started in 1970, right. So we're not far short of our 50 years. We provide behavioural health programs to women, so we are very gender specific. Women, if they have children, are able to consider bringing their children with them. And it's also substance use disorders. It's to help women overcome the use and misuse of drugs and alcohol.
Okay.
We primarily, but not solely, work with the Medicaid, the low-income population.
Sure.
Yeah, so we work with women, as I said. We have a well-lauded program for Native clients. Mm-hmm. We offer residential services. That's been our primary service for a gazillion years. And over the last year or two, we've started an outpatient program, and the women move seamlessly from the residential to the outpatient, and in which they also receive free housing as long as they're engaged in the outpatient program.
Goodness.
We have all masters qualified staff, counsellors. Yeah.
You're quite a large enterprise, and the one thing that really stood out, I mean, you highlighted two programs for us. One was residential substance use disorder treatment, and the other was the outpatient as well version of the program. But the thing I liked about your comments, when we asked you how you evaluate them, you talked about things like getting accommodation, family reunification, children attending school. How on earth do you monitor all that after people have been through the program?
And that's where I'll leave Kristen to speak, but I don't know how long you've been in this field for. I am not a counsellor. Mm-hmm. I still regard myself as a newbie, terribly new in this field. But I think that all of us recognise how hard it is, particularly when you have confidentiality clauses, you have a HIPAA to look after,
sure.
You have people who may not have permanent addresses. So it is tough, but Kristen, our QM, Kristen Lindberg, has been doing this for many years, and she's very au fait with it, so I'll now pass the baton to Kristen.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a couple ways that we're measuring outcomes right now. We have a sort of a demographic and lifestyle survey that is completed at intake at every 30 days and then at discharge from both residential and the outpatient programs. And that's the Nicole's just, it's a survey that's around economic, educational, vocational, housing kinds of questions to see how we're doing with linking people up with the supports they need to be successful when they leave us. Mm-hmm. So that's one tool that we're using. We also have some clinical tools that are evidence-based coming from SAMHSA and from the VA.
Right.
So we're using the Socrates, the BAM, the PCL5, the ACE, and obviously ASAM for substance abuse treatment. I can spell out what those measure if you're interested.
Yes, please.
Okay. So the ACE is the Adverse Childhood Events, I think is what the experiences, yes, Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a one-time assessment tool that's used around early childhood trauma, and how we found there's been a huge correlation in early childhood trauma experiences affecting potential for substance abuse as adults. So we are working very hard to incorporate trauma treatment into all of our curriculum. So we're assessing people for trauma at the time they enter services with us. The Socrates is a scale that's used for readiness for change. So we're looking at that. That actually breaks down into 3 subscores of ambivalence, awareness of the issue, and their willingness to take steps to move forward. So it's an ongoing, every 30 days measurement tool that we use to see whether our interventions are improving our engagement with our clients in treatment, and their awareness of their problems they're dealing with, and their ability to engage with us to make change. The BAM, which is the Brief Addiction Monitoring Tool, that measures a number of things, including risk factors, protective factors, and current use, if there's any use. Also, some of those protective factors and risk factors have to do with some of the economic things that we were talking about, like housing, whether they're involved in 12-step meetings or any other type of support group, how they're doing their relationships with their families, whether they have their financial needs met, food and clothing, and for themselves and their dependents. So that's a 30-day measurement tool as well. And then the PCL-5, the PTSD checklist for the DSM-5, which is a assessment tool for current symptoms that would indicate diagnosis of PTSD. So again, it's not just for PTSD, but on the continuum of symptoms, how are we doing with reducing trauma symptoms?
Well, I'm glad you spelled all that out, Anthony, because some of it I know by acronym only, and that's just been explained to me. So I'm just as pleased as you are, no doubt.
No, that's very helpful. So those are all, I'd assume, national tools, you say, developed by leaders and key government agencies. Are you guys obliged to implement those as part of federal grants?
No. We need to have some type of tool that indicates medical necessity for the residential treatment program. And sort of the industry standard is the ASAM. I didn't actually mention that one. It's a tool that helps identify the level of care that's indicated. Okay. And we have to show some way that is mandated through access to get those to get funding, to get payment for residential treatment. So we don't have to use the ASAM, but it is the one that is generally used. So that is what we're using. The other ones we have just implemented recently into our programming so that we can start looking at symptom reduction and improvement in involvement in the community and with protective factors. We're looking to see that we're reaching our goals. I mean, we've always had these goals that we verbalize and that we work with, in our programming, but to actually be able to demonstrate that it's occurring, we've added some of these assessment tools to help with that process. Okay.
But, in terms of resource implications, it's great that these tools exist and you can implement them, but they must be quite time-intensive?
No, they're self-administered tools.
Right.
They're generally between 10 and 15 to 20 questions that are and actually we're about to implement a new electronic health record. Okay. We're moving to next-gen Topaz. And there's actually a client portal, so they can log on to their own site and do the assessment on their own in our computer center. Right. Okay. So you just seamlessly have integrated this measurement within your day-to-day operations, and you're saying that there's no real resource implications for you as a result of doing this? Resource implications meaning cost. Cost
in terms of financial, people, whatever.
The ASAM there is a minimal cost that per assessment that is encountered through our electronic health record.
Okay.
We actually, when we buy the contract to have the ASAM be part of the program, it bills us per assessment, and I have no idea how much that costs, honestly.
Sure.
Do you know, Margaret?
No, I don't.
We could get that information from Leona. I think she would know. It's a minimal cost, but there is some cost associated with the ASAM. The others are all public domain assessment tools that we can just use.
Okay.
When it comes to what am I trying to say? Costs, of FTE costs, time. Again, these are self-scoring tools that we're building into the system, so we get the interpretation is done by the computer.
Okay.
And so there's very little work and time that's going to be going into that as well. Currently, while we're trying to develop baseline, we don't have the computer system completely in place yet. We're doing them by hand, and so there would be I developed a self-scoring tool through an Excel spreadsheet, so we can get a quick answer that way. But we do have to input the actual scores, so it probably takes about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I can add, Anthony, to this, there is obviously some cost in terms of analysis of the data, looking at the aggregate data, working out if it fits our program, how we need to make changes.
Right.
As you know, it's a decision tool. That's what the ASAM is, and nearly all of these things are. They give us information, but they give us information based on which we will then make decisions about our programming, about our staffing. Are we doing the right thing for the clients? If we cross-ref the results of, let's say, ACE or ASAM with our graduation success, how is it working for us? Do we need to change things? So it's labour-intensive, but in the analysis and decision-making part.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now that makes sense.
Like paying for me.
Working out if we're doing the right things for the client based on, so the ACE is one that's interesting. I've gotten interested in seeing if any one of us have had childhood trauma. How resilient am I versus Kristen versus you, for example, Anthony? And how does this resilience perhaps play into our success in recovery, however it's measured?
Right.
So what it is it's time intensive, but for the greater good, if you can see what I mean.
No.
If we can give this data to the world, then the world might know better how to treat people who need treatment and therapies for recovery.
Okay, no, that's a great position to hold, and it wasn't surprising, but a disappointment is that on a lot of the programs that we've had submitted, people can tell us the cost, they can tell us how many people go through the program, but they don't always look to the wider picture. And I think this is, one of the things that people that we're talking to now are focused on the wider story. So I think that's great.
Well, can I just sort of digress slightly? But that built. Sorry, this is a conversation, not an interview, or at least I've just become.
No,
now.
it needs to be a conversation.
Yeah, right, I agree. We've recognised something that you've just touched upon tangibly. So people can look at the programs, they can look at the cost, they look at the input, and they can look at the output. But for a while now, we at the Haven have been sort of feeling that that's lacking in something. So staff are a bit bored of hearing me say this, and, bear with me. But it's like a story. You've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, using the tools, looking at the people as they come in, give them the tools, give them the therapy, put them out, fine. That's like the middle of the story. We need to know the beginning of the story and then track the end of the story for the complete picture. So from that point of view, what we're doing now is something that's really quite innovative. We're going to take a lot of evidence-based practices and programs, tie them together, and present a neurobiological approach to therapy, which will look at the beginnings, even the pre-beginnings, like before you're born.
Sure.
So we're trying to look at the early part of the story so that when the client comes to us, we can look at their early portion, fit it into the global scenario, devise best therapies for the client in light of not only what's best practice worldwide, but also pertinent and specific to themselves. and then track the effects of this new approach. So, conversationally speaking, not question and answer, we're doing good things.
No, definitely. And but the impetus for that has come internally from your non-profit, or has it come from your sponsors and funders?
Oh, no, it's from us. In fact, we're educating them. We're having we've had a couple of meetings with Access, Phoenix, just to bounce ideas off. And we've also spoken with, just recently, Simpatico, the local REBA. Yeah. And now I want to bring all three of the entities together. That's Access, Simpatico, and us. Because, it's entirely self-driven. We have a staff member who used to be with us, went out into the world, has come back and wants to. She's so gung-ho for this. And I will say that when she spoke about it, it was, for me, like a sense of not quite completion, but the circle is getting tied together.
Okay.
And I will say that the various people have mentioned it to, medical doctors, data analysts in our field, counsellors. Honestly, their eyes light up at this very, very thought. So no, it's not from the funders. The impetus is from us to change the funders, to change what they'll fund, and if we can, to change the emphases, plural, on therapies in Arizona or wider if possible.
Sure. Well, I mean, as I said, that's a great position to have. Unfortunately, I think a number of other non-profits are still very much focused on your inputs, outputs. So if you had a message for them on how they could actually migrate towards a more outcome-driven form of analysis, what words of advice would you give them?
I'm looking at Kristen and she's looking at me because I'm sure we're both going to commit from different approaches, so let's just speak first.
We understand. So, what advice would we give to other nonprofits?
Yes, to make the transition from outputs to outcomes.
I think I would say the first thing to do is identify what our outcomes goals are, and then find measurement tools that will provide those, and then collaborate with whatever community resources you can get to gather that information and to find out what's needed and to find out what's working and what's not. I wanted to bring up as well the fact that we just entered into a collaboration with Simpatico with one of their data analysis people who's helping us work with their information that they have regarding demographics over time. So if we can find out how we're doing versus other types of treatment programs when it comes to readmission rates, relapse rates, applications for housing assistance. We're working on that right now to figure out how to tease out that information, and we've also just entered into an agreement with the Health Information Exchange. So we're hoping that those relationships will also help inform us, and I think that that's part of what we are doing then is, we've identified what we want to measure, what we want to achieve, and now we're trying to use every resource we can find, whether it's research-based or community-based, to come up with a strategy for measuring and evaluating what we're doing.
Okay.
And if I can tag on to Chris, I did say it would be, a song and dance act going on here. So it only just hit me, and maybe Kristen's doing this already, but there's a reference to collaboration and outcomes. So I'm just wondering if we, speaking as any agency right now, not specifically the Haven, if we could involve clients in a design and discussion about outcomes for them, but also part of the issue, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the confidentiality and the HIPAA stuff. Now, I wonder if we could actually get the clients involved in giving us permission for them to work with us on the outcomes for them in a more global sense, so that they have buy-in, and it's not, we want to measure you, but how are we going to see your future life? And I don't want to say in recovery, but how do we want to see your future life? How can we measure your successes so that we can present to the rest of the world that being in in the disease of addiction does not mean the end of the world. In other words, how can we reduce the stigma by promoting, working with you to show the world that it's not the end of the world if you do have addiction as a disease. So maybe that's, taking a slightly different tack. Maybe Christmas is already doing it. But actually, let's engage. Let the other non-profits, let us actually engage the clients in designing a way to reduce the stigma, to get people into therapy so they can have a good life and they can show they've had a good life.
No, that definitely sounds good. And I mean, you're a major part of the non-profit landscape. Health and human services, really do dominate the 23,000 non-profits that are within the state. But I think that there is definitely something there that you could encourage other non-profits in the arts or culture or education fields or wherever to work more with their clients to devise appropriate outcomes, because I think it's needed. So that's great advice. I think,
to answer a little bit of that, what we've got planned, I agree that that's outstanding if we can get to that point.
Yeah.
We've got some of that slightly in the works. We were actually, Nicole and I were talking about it today, that we really want to develop our aftercare program so that we continue to maintain contact with people after they've completed treatment, and we get that feedback loop continuing. How they're doing, where they had challenges after they left us, that kind of thing. So we're looking at how are we going to be able to continue a relationship with people once they've graduated from our programming. The other thing is, and this is sort of a larger term strategic goal of mine with my whole QMPI plan, is to involve clients, active clients and former clients in our quality management performance improvement process.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm quite excited. Just before our conversation, Anthony, we were both walking into the office, and one of our prior clients, we're going back now 10 years or so, one of our prior clients who then became a staff member after an appropriate period of time, then went and joined another agency, is now coming back to do a master's intern here. She's bought her own house, she's extending it, she is a success story, and I think that she would be great in working with us to work with other clients to design this.
Exactly.
Oh, she'd be great. But she makes me almost want to cry when I see her, because if we've got even a handful of these, and we do have, then we have helped possibly stymie the intergenerational nature of this disease. Children are going to see their mothers living an entirely different life. The chances that children will therefore live a different life are enhanced greatly. Yes. So, we have the big picture. We're not a sausage factory by any means. Bring them in and then that's it. No, we've got a bigger perspective in mind, the bigger things we want to work to. And it's only through having solid staff that are on board with this, that have the right qualifications in this, and a similar outlook, that we can actually achieve it. Otherwise, you're battling the dark forces.
Sure. Well, as I say, I mean, it was the reference to family reunification and children attending school that really sort of caught our sight when we were flicking through all the different survey responses. So that's really why we called you today. I think that's basically our questions. Have you got anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I do have the obvious one, Anthony, but where are you from?
I'm from Wales.
No, you're not. Not that accent.
I am from South Wales, just outside Cardiff.
All right, I wouldn't have put you there, that door.
Where did you
lived there all your life?
No, I've moved around. Goodness, I started off there. I went to college in London, college in Leicester, college in Sheffield, worked in Bangor in North Wales. Then I went to work down in Southampton. Then I worked it back in London. Went back home to Wales to work, and then ended up here for the last 7 years.
Well, all right then. Okay, so I was way out. I had you as Lancashire.
Lancashire. No. So I take it. I thought I could detect an English accent.
Right. Yes, you could. Not dissimilar to yours. Born in Lancashire, though, not Wales. Born in Lancashire. Lived in the Midlands. Lived in the South. So Stoke-on-Trent, Crewe, Brighton.
Oh, God.
Paisley, Australia, New Zealand, North Africa, America. different places. But no, I would not have put you as primarily Welsh. Not in a million years.
Yeah, it's strange. I get accused of being from New Zealand here.
No.
Australia, I do, and I always remind them, well, that's where an awful lot of convicts got shipped from, was Wales to Australia and New Zealand, so I don't know.
How did you end up in Arizona at ASU?
My former PhD supervisor from many years ago, he's one of the heads here in the department, and it just came out there. He said, oh, why don't you come and join us? So I did 7 years ago. It was a little bit drier than Wales.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Yeah. Did you? So where are you with? Are you with?